Difficult experiences in life often teach us a lot of wisdom. And the insights we learn about God, ourselves, and the world can be priceless to those around us as they face their own trials. This was certainly true for the prophet Hosea. He received revelations from God in challenging circumstances over many decades. And in his later years, the Holy Spirit inspired him to compile these revelations to offer wisdom to ancient Israel and Judah as they faced some serious trials.
This is the second lesson in our series, The Prophetic Wisdom of Hosea, and we've entitled it, Revelations for the Wise. In this lesson, we'll see how Hosea designed his book from beginning to end to impart wisdom to God's ancient people. In our previous lesson, we learned that the book of Hosea begins with a title in chapter 1, verse 1 that introduces the full timeline of Hosea's ministry. And it ends with a closure in chapter 14, verse 9 that calls Hosea's readers to gain wisdom from his prophecies. Between these verses, the body of Hosea consists of three main divisions. The first division, in chapter 1, verse 2, through chapter 3, verse 5, focuses on both judgment and hope from God. The second division, in chapter 4, verse 1 through chapter 9, verse 9, looks more closely at God's unfolding judgment against his people. And the third division, in chapter 9, verse 10 through chapter 14, verse 8, returns to the unfolding hope God revealed through Hosea's prophecies. We also summarize the overarching purpose of Hosea's book in this way. The book of Hosea called the leaders of Judah to gain wisdom from what God had revealed throughout Hosea's ministry as they faced the challenges of Sennacherib's invasion. As the summary points out, the leaders of Judah desperately needed wisdom. God threatened devastating judgment against Judah during or possibly just after Sennacherib's invasion in the days of King Hezekiah. And Hosea's book called Judah's leaders to gain discernment from what God had revealed throughout Hosea's ministry, so they could guide God's people in these trying times. To explore how Hosea fulfilled this purpose, we'll point to the revelations for the wise that Hosea included in each major division of his book. We'll start with his prophecies of judgment and hope in the first division. Then we'll consider his announcements of unfolding judgment in the second division. And finally, we'll explore his revelations of unfolding hope in the third division. Let's look first at insights disclosed in Hosea's prophecies of judgment and hope. You'll recall that the first division of Hosea, in chapter 1, verse 2, through chapter 3, verse 5, consists of prophecies Hosea received in northern Israel during the reign of Jeroboam II. As we learned in our previous lesson, these were prophecies about Assyria's rise to prominence in 744 BC. In this lesson, we'll see that Hosea's presentation of these early revelations carefully balanced every threat of God's judgment with hopeful reassurances that God would still bless his people in the future.
By the time Hosea wrote his book, the kingdom of Israel had fallen under God's severe judgment, and the threat of judgment had come against Judah as well. These harsh realities were disappointing and confusing to the leaders of Judah. What was God doing? What should they believe about the future? In the first 3 chapters of his book, Hosea began to provide the leaders of Judah with wisdom as they dealt with these kinds of questions.
As we look at Hosea's chapters on judgment and hope from God, we'll begin with their original meaning, their significance for those who first received his book. Then we'll explore the modern application of these chapters. Let's start with Hosea's original meaning for our book's first audience. If Hosea had summarized the revelations he offered in the first division of his book, he might have said something like this. After a period of judgment, Israel will receive God's blessings in the latter days through reunification with Judah and submission to David's house. On the one hand, Hosea's prophecies taught that God's blessings would come to the northern tribes of Israel after they'd endured a period of judgment. But on the other hand, they also taught that God would pour out these blessings in the latter days through Israel's reunification with Judah and their submission to David's house. We'll look at the original meaning of this division in two steps. First, Hosea disclosed God's plan that Israel would receive God's blessings after a period of judgment. Second, Hosea clarified that those blessings would come through Judah. Let's explore both of these steps, beginning with Hosea's teaching that God's blessings would come to Israel after a time of judgment. Hosea began this division with a personal account of his earlier family experiences in chapter 1, verse 2 through chapter 2, verse 1. This section starts with a family narrative in chapter 1, verses 2 through 9. In verses 2 and 3, God commanded Hosea to marry Gomer, a wife, or woman of whoredom. This description indicates that Gomer was one of the many prostitutes who served in Israel's fertility worship centers. Her way of life cast a dark shadow over Hosea's marriage. But more than this, their marriage symbolized that God had joined himself through covenant with an unfaithful people, the people of Israel. Then, in verses 4 through 9, God commanded Hosea to give his children specific names that revealed Israel's condition before God. Hosea's first son was named Jezreel. 2 Kings chapter 10 explains that Jeroboam II's ancestor, King Jehu, had established his dynasty with horrific violence at Jezreel. Naming Hosea's first son, Jezreel, revealed that violent judgment was soon to come to Israel. Hosea's second child, a daughter, was named Lo-Ruhamah, which may be translated not loved or no mercy. This name indicated that God was going to stop showing love and mercy to the kingdom of Israel. Finally, God commanded Hosea to name his third child Lo-Ami, which means not my people. This son's name revealed that for a period of time, God would treat Israel as if it were a Gentile nation under his wrath. Hosea's earlier family experiences revealed the terrible judgment that was coming to Israel. But Hosea immediately balanced these words of judgment with some divinely inspired, hopeful prophetic reflections in chapter 1, verse 10 through chapter 2, verse 1. Here, he declared that despite the devastation that was coming against Israel, God would still fulfill the promises he'd made to Abraham in Genesis chapters 13 and 22. Listen to Hosea chapter 1, verse 10, where Hosea announced, "The children of Israel shall be like the sand of the sea, which cannot be measured or numbered. And in the place where it was said to them, 'You are not my people,' it shall be said to them, 'Children of the living God.'"
We find in the prophetic books that sometimes the Lord, in order to emphasize his determination to fulfill his promises, used symbols. He made use of symbolic actions. So when he asked Hosea to marry a prostitute, what God wanted was to illustrate vividly the infidelity of his people, how his people had acted like an adulterous woman, even more like a prostitute, going after other gods, the gods of other nations. But by means of the prophet Hosea, he showed that in spite of the prostitutions of his people, the infidelity of his people, he remained faithful to his covenant.
Following this balanced account of his earlier family experiences, Hosea turned to God's first lawsuit in his book in chapter 2, verses 2 through 23. As we usually expect with prophetic lawsuits, In chapter 2, verses 2 through 13, God declared in the court of heaven that northern Israel was going to suffer his curses. Like Gomer and her worship prostitution, the Israelites had been unfaithful to God, and God was going to curse them through the rise of the Assyrian Empire. But unlike most divine lawsuits, this lawsuit didn't end with curses from God. On the contrary, in verses 14 through 23, God also spoke of blessings that would come after Israel's judgment. Listen to God's hopeful words in chapter 2, verse 18. I will make for them a covenant on that day with the beasts of the field, the birds of the heavens, and the creeping things of the ground. And I will abolish the bow, the sword, and war from the land, and I will make you lie down in safety. Here we see that God expressed the certainty of a grand future after judgment by promising to make a covenant with Israel, a covenant that later prophets also predicted. Jeremiah chapter 31, verse 31 speaks of this covenant as a new covenant. And Isaiah chapter 54, verse 10, and Ezekiel chapter 34, verse 25, and chapter 37, verse 26 all refer to it as a covenant of peace. Here, Hosea's prophecy focused on how God's blessing would restore nature, the beasts of the field, the birds of the heavens, and the creeping things of the ground. And God also promised the cessation of violence from Assyria. He would abolish the bow, the sword, and war, and Israel would lie down in safety. After recording how judgment and hope were revealed in his earlier family experiences and in God's first lawsuit, Hosea turned to an account of his later family experiences in chapter 3, verses 1 through 5. Chapter 3 begins with an autobiographical family narrative in verses 1 through 3. Gomer, we learn, had returned to worship prostitution. But God commanded Hosea in verse 1 to go again to Gomer, love a woman who is an adulteress. Hosea obeyed, but in verse 3 he told Gomer that she was to be without a man for many days. Still, Hosea was careful to balance these words of judgment with a second set of divinely inspired, hopeful prophetic reflections. In chapter 3, verses 4 and 5, we read this: For the children of Israel shall dwell many days without king or prince, without sacrifice or pillar, without ephod or household gods. Afterward the children of Israel shall come in fear to the Lord and to his goodness. As this passage indicates, Gomer's time without a man symbolized that Israel would have to endure a long period of devastation without king or prince, without sacrifice or pillar, without ephod or household gods. But once again, Hosea stressed the hopeful outlook that after this judgment ended, Israel would receive God's goodness or blessings. Now that we've seen how the original meaning of the first division emphasized God's blessings after a period of judgment, let's explore the revelation that these future blessings would come through Judah. You'll recall that during the first stage of Hosea's ministry, Uzziah, the king of Judah, was faithful to God. So, while God pronounced judgments on the northern kingdom of Israel at this time, he responded quite differently to the southern kingdom. In chapter 1, verse 7, he said, I will have mercy on the house of Judah. But as we're about to see, Hosea's prophecies in this first division had much more than this to say about Judah. Listen to the second part of Hosea's revelations from the first division. Hosea taught Judah's leaders that Israel will receive God's blessings in the latter days through reunification with Judah and submission to David's house. To understand why Hosea focused his revelations on God's blessings coming through Judah, we need to review 3 Old Testament themes that shaped Hosea's prophecies. In the first place, from as early as the patriarchal period, the Old Testament stressed the importance of the unity of the 12 tribes of Israel. The book of Genesis indicates this ideal, particularly in the reconciliation of Joseph and his brothers. And the books of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, and Samuel also promote the unity of all Israel. Of course, Hosea began his ministry when the tribes of Israel and Judah were divided and at odds with each other. But in line with these earlier biblical ideals, Hosea stressed that God's future blessings for Israel would require reunification of the 12 tribes. In the second place, Hosea also drew from the Old Testament theme of submission to David's house. Several earlier biblical books, especially Judges, Samuel, and Kings, as well as a number of early Psalms, confirm that David's house, the royal line of Judah, was to be the permanent dynasty over all of God's people. Like the first theme, this theme is rooted in the story of Joseph and his brothers. In Genesis chapter 49, verse 10, the patriarch Jacob prophesied over his sons and predicted that the scepter, a symbol of royal authority, shall not depart from Judah. So, at a time when the northern tribes rejected the authority of David's throne, Hosea stressed that Israel's future blessings would require their renewed submission to the rule of David's house. In the third place, to grasp Hosea's hopeful words about blessings through Judah, it's also important to keep in mind God's ultimate goal for all of history. As many Old Testament historical books and the Psalms indicate, the reason God's people were to be unified under David's house was ultimately to spread God's kingdom to the ends of the earth. As before, we can see this theme as early as the story of Joseph and his brothers. When Jacob prophesied over his son Judah in Genesis chapter 49, verse 10, he not only said, "The scepter shall not depart from Judah," he also said, "To him shall be the obedience of the peoples," or nations, as it may be translated. In the end, the 12 tribes of Israel, united under the rule of Judah's king, will spread God's reign to the whole world. And Hosea's earliest prophecies about Judah promoted this glorious vision of the future. In light of this background, listen to Hosea chapter 1, verse 11, and the way Hosea touched on these themes. "The children of Judah and the children of Israel shall be gathered together, and they shall appoint for themselves one head, and they shall go up from the land. For great shall be the day of Jezreel." Here, Hosea predicted that the day of Jezreel, the violence Assyria was going to bring against northern Israel, would be great. But after this judgment from God, the children of Judah and the children of Israel shall be gathered together into one reunified nation. And they will appoint for themselves one head, or king. And in chapter 3, verse 5, Hosea elaborated on these Old Testament outlooks in this way. "Afterward, the children of Israel shall return and seek the Lord their God, and David their king. And they shall come in fear to the Lord, and to his goodness in the latter days." As we see here, afterward, after Israel's time of judgment, the children of Israel shall seek not only the Lord their God, but also David their king. And notice that Hosea said these events would occur in the latter days. This phrase comes from the Hebrew expression ba'acharit hayamim. In other passages, this and similar phrases are simply translated in the future. But here, it's rightly translated in the latter days, a reference to the culmination of history after the exile of God's people, when God's purposes will be fulfilled. As we've noted in other series, a number of Old Testament prophets drew the expression "the latter days" from Deuteronomy chapter 4, verses 25 through 31. In these verses, Moses warned God's people that if they flagrantly violated God's covenant, then God would give them over to their enemies and exile them from the promised land. But in verse 30, Moses reassured God's people that in the latter days they would repent and their exile would be over. In accordance with Moses' predictions, Hosea prophesied that northern Israel would suffer severely under God's judgment. But as we've just seen, he also reaffirmed that they would repent, reunite with Judah, and submit to David's house. And all of this would bring about the blessings of the latter days, when history would reach its grand finale, and God's kingdom would spread throughout the world.
There are times where you see the phrase latter days used, say, in the Pentateuch. One example is that at the end of Deuteronomy chapter 4. In that context, what Moses is warning Israel about is they're about to enter into the promised land, that when they get into the promised land, he says that if they disobey God and don't follow what's expected in the Sinai covenant, that ultimately they could get kicked out of the promised land and sent into exile. So what Moses is warning or speaking about is once they've been kicked out of the land or in exile due to disobedience, what he says, though, is there's still hope for those people who've been kicked out of the land, that in the latter days they can turn to God and call upon him and bring them back. And of course, this is a wonderful glimpse of our God who is willing to not give up on his people, but bring them back and restore them, which lays a great theological basis for who God is, a God who restores, a God who redeems, even after sin, that provides a basis for understanding God's later acts in the person of Jesus Christ and what he will do in the end, ultimately.
Now, it's easy to see why Hosea first delivered these early prophecies of judgment and hope in northern Israel during the reign of Jeroboam II. God called him to warn Israel of the divine judgment that was coming and to urge them to seek God's mercy. And even though northern Israel ignored Hosea's prophecies and suffered God's judgment, Hosea's purpose for delivering these warnings was clear. But why did Hosea include these balanced prophecies of judgment and hope decades later when he composed his book in Judah? What did he hope to accomplish? Well, for one, these early prophecies offered Judah's leaders in Hezekiah's day a solid foundation for understanding the wisdom of Hosea's entire book. Just as Israel had before them, Judah was now facing God's judgment, and they needed the revelations found in Hosea's book to guide them. But Hosea also wrote this first division of his book to remind Judah of God's ultimate plan for his people. No matter what had happened, or was still to happen, there was only one way that God's blessings in the latter days would unfold. One of David's sons would reunite the nation and lead both Israel and Judah into God's grand blessings. We should note that according to 2 Chronicles chapter 30, early in his reign, Hezekiah attempted to reunite Israel and Judah under his rule as a son of David. But later on, he turned away from God, and his attempt failed. Israel remained in disarray, and Judah fell under God's judgment, still awaiting the blessings that were to come in the latter days.